breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
But it's very rare in elders. And even you go online, the amount of elders that are missing is very small. And if it is, it's they're missing for other reasons, not because of a kidnapping. So all of those things you have against you in terms of trying to even come up with a profile, because it's such a small population that would ever abduct an elder. So no evidence. That's and the mixed DNA. I think that's what's really hard.
When you were working with the profiling unit, do they have enough to come up with something at this point, just based on what happened? You know, there's that photo from the front camera. Is there something more that they could be releasing to the public that would help with tips and sort of help narrow down the search?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know I've been on a few other blogs way back when this first came out, and I always wanted to know, how did they get in? That's one of your first questions. Somebody had to have gotten in. There's no forced entry. There's nothing. So how that could have helped an awful lot if you could have. We have to just speculate that it was someone that either watched when this garage door went up, or had been in there when she had gone out and was hiding there. I mean, all of those scenarios I've seen. I've actually had cases where that's happened. But you just have to say these are possibilities.
We are getting breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. Day 73, and the developments coming out of Tucson tonight are not what you think. This is not another case going cold. This is not another elderly missing person fading into silence. This is a biological puzzle that standard forensic technology cannot currently solve, an institutional failure in the first 48 hours that may have compromised the entire investigation, and a journalist who refused to leave when every other outlet moved on. Brian Entin, NewsNation's senior national correspondent, is reporting tonight that new DNA mixture deconvolution software has almost certainly been fast-tracked specifically because of this case. A technology company changed its entire release schedule because of Nancy Guthrie. Meanwhile, a cold case detective who specializes in exactly this type of crime believes the kidnappers made a fatal miscalculation. They underestimated the physical fragility of an 84-year-old woman entirely dependent on a pacemaker to sustain her life. And if he is right, this was never a kidnapping for ransom. It became something else entirely the moment it began. Before we go any further, if you believe Nancy Guthrie deserves answers, hit that like button right now and subscribe to True Crime Case Study. We stay on cases when others walk away. We connect dots mainstream media misses. We demand accountability when systems fail. Your support keeps this investigation alive. Let's start with what makes this case statistically extraordinary. Because before you can understand why this investigation has unfolded the way it has, you need to understand how rare elder kidnapping actually is. Go online right now and search for missing elderly persons. The numbers are small, very small. And when elderly individuals do go missing, it is almost never because of an abduction. It is medical wandering. It is confusion related to dementia. It is voluntary departure due to cognitive decline. It is not kidnapping. That statistical rarity creates a profiling problem that investigators in Tucson have been struggling with since February 1st. There is no robust behavioral database for people who abduct the elderly. The population of offenders who would target an 84-year-old woman is so narrow that standard profiling techniques struggle to gain traction. You cannot build a profile when the comparison set barely exists. Experts who work with profiling units have been asked directly whether there is enough evidence in this case to develop something useful. The answer is complicated. There is a photo from the front camera. There are details from the scene. There is a behavioral pattern emerging from ransom communications. But all of that has to be analyzed against a backdrop of almost no historical precedent. One of the first questions any investigator asks in a case like this is, how did the perpetrator gain entry? In the Nancy Guthrie case, that question remains publicly unanswered. There is no documented forced entry, no broken windows, no kicked-in doors, no pried locks, nothing that suggests a violent breach of the property. That detail alone is significant. It tells us something about how this crime unfolded. Experts have noted that this information could have helped the investigation enormously if it had been clarified early. Instead, we are left with scenarios that remain speculative but grounded in investigative precedent. Someone may have watched when the garage door went up and timed their entry to that moment of vulnerability. Or someone may have been inside the home already, hidden, waiting for Nancy to return from an outing. Both scenarios have occurred in documented cases. Both require a level of premeditation that points away from random opportunism and toward planning. But without confirmation of the entry method, the investigation loses a critical piece of the puzzle that could narrow the suspect pool significantly. Now let's talk about the man who has been asking these questions longer and more persistently than anyone else. Brian Entin is the senior national correspondent for NewsNation. He arrived in Tucson in the earliest days of this investigation, and 73 days later, he is still there. While other media outlets rotated reporters through on weekly cycles, while the national news cycle moved on to the next story, while coverage faded and public attention drifted, Entin stayed. His sustained physical presence on the ground has created something that no remote coverage can replicate: proximity. When you are there day after day, sources start reaching out directly. Whistleblowers begin to trust you with details they would never share with a correspondent who flies in for a live shot and flies out the same afternoon. Neighbors speak to you because you were there last week and the week before that, when no cameras were rolling and no breaking news banner was flashing. Retired NYPD Sergeant Joe Giacalone sat down with Entin this week on Brian Entin Investigates and said something that cuts to the heart of what is wrong with how this case has been handled. He said there comes a point where you have to go shake the trees and create your own leads. You cannot sit back and wait for DNA. Get off your butts and go out there. That frustration, aimed squarely at the official investigation, is precisely what Entin has been doing journalistically since day one. He has been shaking trees in a case where the institutional framework around the official investigation has been cracking from the inside. And here is the detail that tells you everything about what kind of reporter Brian Entin is. After weeks of covering this case, he admitted publicly that it had changed him personally. He installed a security camera for his own elderly mother. He recognized that she was living alone in exactly the kind of vulnerability that Nancy Guthrie was living in. A journalist trained to maintain professional detachment was so affected by what he was witnessing in Tucson that he changed his own family security arrangements. That is not a career footnote. That is a human being who cannot look away from what this case means. And what Entin has uncovered in the past 73 days should make every person following this investigation rethink what they thought they knew. An anonymous law enforcement source with direct knowledge of the Pima County Sheriff's Department sat down with Brian Entin and revealed something that reframes the entire investigation from the very beginning. The first 48 hours may have been compromised. The supervisor assigned to lead the investigation on February 1st, the very day Nancy Guthrie was reported missing, had allegedly never led a homicide investigation, had never handled a major kidnapping case. That is not a minor administrative oversight. That is a structural failure at the precise moment when structure mattered most. Instead of being immediately sealed and treated as a serious crime scene, the property was approached as a search and rescue operation. First responders operated under the assumption that Nancy Guthrie had simply wandered off. A missing senior. Not a kidnapping. Not a violent abduction. Just an elderly woman who had become disoriented and left her home. That assumption had consequences that cannot be undone. Microscopic evidence, the smallest yet most crucial biological traces, may have been inadvertently contaminated or lost in those first critical hours. Specialized forensic units were not the first to arrive. And here is the detail that should alarm everyone. The bloodstains on the porch, clear indicators of violence, only came to full investigative attention after media reporting highlighted their significance. Think about what that means. Obvious physical evidence of a violent crime was not immediately recognized and processed the way it should have been. It took journalists asking questions and publishing reports before that evidence received the level of scrutiny it deserved from the beginning. The institutional failure in those first 48 hours may have given whoever did this the only head start they needed. Now let's turn to the DNA, because this is where the case currently lives. The DNA recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home is a biological puzzle that standard forensic technology cannot solve. It is a mixed sample, multiple people's genetic material overlapping on the same surfaces. This is not unusual in a family residence where relatives visit regularly and touch the same doorknobs, countertops, and furniture, but it creates a forensic challenge that existing database systems are not designed to handle. The CODIS system, the FBI's combined DNA index system that contains genetic profiles of convicted offenders across the country, cannot produce a reliable identification from a mixed sample. It is built for single-source DNA. One person's genetic material, clearly isolated, run against a database of known profiles. When you have 3, 4, or 5 people's DNA layered on top of each other, CODIS cannot tell you which sequence belongs to whom. Standard STR analysis, the short tandem repeat technology that has been the backbone of forensic DNA work for decades, is similarly limited. It can tell you that multiple contributors are present, but it cannot reliably separate those contributors and isolate the genetic signature of the person you are actually trying to identify. SNP analysis, single nucleotide polymorphism technology, is more advanced and better suited for complex mixtures. But even SNP technology requires software sophisticated enough to deconvolve the mixture, to strip it apart layer by layer and isolate the unknown contributor from the known family members whose DNA is expected to be present. That software exists, but it is still emerging. It is not standard in every forensic lab, and the version powerful enough to handle the most complex mixtures has been in development for years. Here is where the story takes a turn that should give everyone following this case a reason to hope. A source inside the scientific community told Brian Entin that new mixture deconvolution software has almost certainly been fast-tracked specifically because of Nancy Guthrie. Think about what that means. A technology company looked at the public attention on this case, looked at the forensic roadblock it represents, and decided to move up their release schedule. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance became the forcing function for a technological breakthrough that was already in development but not yet deployed. Companies want to make their name on high-profile cases. Deconvolution experts see an opportunity to demonstrate their capability on a platform that has national visibility. So there is a good chance, according to experts who spoke with Entin, that people and companies are working behind the scenes right now to solve this DNA puzzle, not just because it is the right thing to do, but because it is a career-making opportunity. Some of those companies will seek public recognition. Others, like Astria Forensics, work quietly in partnership with labs like DNA Labs International, pushing the technology forward without needing the spotlight. Either way, the work is happening. The question is whether it will happen fast enough. One DNA expert interviewed by Brian Entin raised a possibility that investigators may be hoping for, but have not publicly confirmed. A second crime scene. The logic is straightforward. If all the DNA collected from Nancy's residence has resulted in an unsolvable complex mixture, then the best hope for a breakthrough is finding another location where Nancy was taken. Somewhere she was held, the vehicle she was transported in, a secondary site where the perpetrator's DNA might be present without the contamination of family members who live in and visit the home. That would give investigators a whole new opportunity to find clean, single-source DNA belonging to the person or persons responsible. The expert pointed to a case that happened around the same time as Nancy's disappearance. A grandfather was kidnapped in Australia in what turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. Investigators found a second crime scene, a location where the victim had been held, and that discovery provided a significant amount of additional evidence that helped solve the case. The expert was surprised that more people did not talk about that case in the context of Nancy Guthrie, because it demonstrates that second crime scenes can and do provide the breakthrough investigators need when the primary scene does not yield usable evidence. The grim reality, acknowledged by the expert, is that if Nancy's body is discovered, that too would constitute a second crime scene and would provide another opportunity for DNA recovery. But the hope, stated clearly, is that this case does not go quiet. That it does not fade into the silence that swallows so many missing persons investigations when the initial leads run dry and the media moves on. But here's the question that hangs over everything. Even with new technology, even with companies fast-tracking software development, is this DNA mixture actually solvable? The expert was honest. The answer depends on variables we do not know. How many people are in the mixture? What are the percentage proportions of each contributor? Which profile belongs to the perpetrator? It is possible that the mixture contains 5 different people's genetic material, and the person investigators are trying to identify might represent only 10% of that total sample. The remaining 90% could be Nancy, her family members, friends who visited the home, service workers who were there legitimately. If the perpetrator's DNA is only a small fraction of the mixture, the chances of successfully isolating and identifying that sequence drop significantly. The expert could not say definitively that the technology will crack this case, only that the technology is improving and that efforts are being made. That uncertainty is where the investigation currently sits, waiting, hoping, racing against time and the statistical reality that cases grow colder with every day that passes without a break. There is another theory circulating among experts who have studied this case, a theory that, if correct, would explain every single anomaly that has puzzled observers since February. The contradictory ransom notes, the erratic Bitcoin demands, the shifts in the story. Detective Brian Entin, a cold case specialist from the Fort Wayne Police Department who has spent his career studying exactly this type of crime, told Brian Entin that he believes the kidnappers made a catastrophic miscalculation. They underestimated the physical fragility of an 84-year-old woman who was entirely dependent on a pacemaker to keep her heart functioning. Martin said it scares him to think that somebody took Nancy Guthrie and she had some sort of medical event while it was happening, because obviously it would be an incredibly stressful situation, incredibly taxing on somebody. Think about what that theory implies. An elderly woman with a known heart condition, dependent on medical technology, subjected to the terror and physical strain of a violent abduction. Her body, already vulnerable, pushed beyond what it could withstand. If Nancy suffered a cardiovascular crisis during the abduction itself, if the pacemaker failed, or if her heart could not handle the trauma, then the entire plan the kidnappers had built would have collapsed in real time. A ransom operation depends on having a living hostage. If the hostage dies before the first demand is even delivered, the perpetrators are left managing a disaster they did not plan for and are not prepared to handle. That would explain the ransom communications that followed. Not as a coherent negotiation strategy, but as a cover story being improvised by people whose plan had already gone catastrophically wrong. It would explain why the demands shifted, why the story changed, why the tone moved from confident control to something more desperate and erratic. If this theory is correct, this was never a successful kidnapping for ransom. It became something else entirely the moment Nancy's body could not survive what was being done to her. Now, let's talk about what happens when a case this complex hits a wall. When the DNA is mixed and unsolvable with current technology, when the entry point is unknown, when the first 48 hours were mishandled and critical evidence may have been lost. What do investigators do? According to Joe Giacalone, the retired NYPD sergeant who spoke with Entin, they need to get off their butts and go shake the trees. They need to create their own leads instead of sitting back and waiting for a lab result that may or may not ever come. That means re-interviewing witnesses. That means canvassing the neighborhood again with fresh eyes. That means looking at financial records, phone records, surveillance footage from businesses near the Catalina Foothills property. That means pressure. Public pressure. Investigative pressure. The kind of pressure that makes people who know something uncomfortable enough to finally say it. Giacalone's frustration was clear. You have nothing until the DNA comes back. And even if it comes back, you do not know if it will be usable. So you cannot afford to wait passively. You have to work the case actively, aggressively, relentlessly. The question is whether that is happening. Whether the task force that has taken over this investigation is shaking those trees or whether they are waiting for the technology to save them. Brian Entin has stayed in Tucson because he understands something fundamental about investigative journalism. Presence matters. Accountability matters. When the institution cracks, when the official investigation stumbles, when the system that is supposed to protect people fails, someone has to be there to document it. Someone has to ask the questions that are not being asked. Someone has to refuse to let the case fade into silence. That is what Entin has done for 73 days, and the information he has uncovered, the sources he has cultivated, the experts he has brought into the conversation, have created a body of work that is holding this investigation to a standard it was not holding itself to in the beginning. The blood evidence that only came to full attention after media reporting. The inexperienced supervisor who allegedly had never led a homicide case. The misclassification of the scene as a wandering senior search instead of a violent abduction. These are not minor details. These are foundational failures that have consequences which cannot be undone. And the only reason we know about them is because a journalist stayed when others left. Let's return to the DNA for a moment because this is the thread that will either break this case or leave it unsolved indefinitely. Mixture deconvolution is not science fiction. It is real, it works, and it has solved cases that seemed impossible just a few years ago. The technology analyzes the genetic signatures in a mixed sample and uses statistical algorithms to separate the contributors. It identifies which sequences are most likely to belong to each person and isolates the unknown contributor from the known individuals whose DNA is expected to be present. The software is extraordinarily complex. It requires massive computational power and sophisticated probability modeling, but it works. The question is whether the mixture from Nancy's home is within the range of what current or near-future software can handle. If there are too many contributors, if the percentages are too imbalanced, if the perpetrator's DNA is too small a fraction of the total sample, even the best technology may not be able to extract a clean profile. And if that happens, the investigation will need the second crime scene that experts have talked about. The vehicle, the location where Nancy was held, or the outcome no one wants, the discovery of her body. Any of those would provide a fresh opportunity for DNA recovery in a context where the mixture problem might not exist. The case is also waiting on something else: public memory, tips, the detail that someone saw but did not think was important, the conversation that felt slightly off but did not seem worth reporting. The question that a neighbor or acquaintance asked about Nancy's schedule or her security system. Those details matter. They might seem insignificant in isolation, but in the context of an investigation that is struggling for traction, they could be the thread that unravels everything. That is why the tip line remains open. That is why investigators continue to ask for any information, no matter how small, because the most important witness in this case may not even realize they are a witness yet. They might think what they saw or heard was nothing. But in a case built on forensic puzzles and institutional failures, nothing might be everything. There is a broader question that this case forces us to confront. What happens when the system fails the most vulnerable among us? Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She lived alone. She was dependent on a pacemaker. She represents a population that is growing as our society ages, and that population is uniquely vulnerable to exactly this kind of crime. Elder abuse, elder exploitation, and elder abduction are not common, but when they do occur, the victims are often unable to defend themselves, unable to call for help, unable to survive the physical trauma of what is being done to them. The fact that the initial response to Nancy's disappearance was a wandering senior search instead of a criminal investigation tells you something about how our institutions perceive elderly victims. There was an assumption baked into that response, an assumption that an 84-year-old woman missing from her home must have wandered off due to confusion or disorientation. That assumption delayed the proper forensic response. It allowed critical hours to pass without the scene being secured the way it should have been. It may have cost investigators evidence they can never recover. And it reflects a societal blind spot about the realities of elder victimization. We assume the elderly are not targeted for violent crime. We assume they are safe in their homes. We assume that when they go missing, it is a medical issue, not a criminal one. Nancy Guthrie's case is proof that those assumptions can be catastrophically wrong. Brian Entin's decision to install a security camera for his own mother after covering this case is a small but telling detail. It means he looked at what happened to Nancy and recognized that it could happen to anyone, that the vulnerability is not unique, that the risk is real, and that the systems we trust to protect our loved ones are not always adequate. His mother, like Nancy, lives alone. Like Nancy, she is elderly. Like Nancy, she could be targeted by someone who sees her age as an opportunity rather than a reason for protection. Entin took action based on what he learned in Tucson. The question is whether the rest of us are paying attention. 73 days is a long time in a missing persons investigation, long enough for trails to go cold, long enough for witnesses to forget details, long enough for public attention to drift. But it is also long enough for forensic technology to catch up, long enough for sources to develop trust and come forward with information they were holding back, long enough for pressure to build on the people responsible until they make a mistake. The DNA software that is being fast-tracked because of this case could be ready in weeks or months. The second crime scene that investigators hope to find could be discovered tomorrow or never.
Yes, I think there's a good chance that people would like to make their name on, being a deconvolution expert on this case because it is so high profile and it does provide a platform for somebody to help solve it and, again, make a name for themselves or their company. So I think that's possible. But there's also companies behind the scenes that really aren't looking for that type of recognition that could be working with DNA Labs International and trying to help them push that forward. So it's not necessarily a competing company. It could be a company like Astrea that partners with a lot of the labs that do this work.
I heard you say somewhere that you think there needs to be a second crime scene. What did you mean by that?
Well, it's not that I think there needs to be, but I think that if they have collected all of the potential DNA at the residence and all they've ended up with is this complex DNA mixture, then my hope is that they will discover a second crime scene somewhere where Nancy was held, or perhaps the car that she was transported in, because that gives a whole nother opportunity for finding the DNA of the perpetrator. And so if they've not been successful in finding a good source of his DNA at Nancy's home, my hope is they'll get another chance. Now, the really sad part of that is, if they find her body, if she's deceased, that gives them another opportunity. And so I don't think it's the end. I'm really hoping that this, just doesn't go quiet and we never hear anything again. And so that there was a grandfather kidnapped in Australia, and it was apparently mistaken identity. It happened right around the same time as Nancy's case, and I was surprised more people didn't talk about it. But they found a second crime scene. They found a location where he had been held, and that gave them a lot of additional evidence. And so that's what really kind of got me thinking in that way.
That makes sense. If they don't, though, and all they have is this DNA sample from the house, which we know is mixed, and they're having maybe trouble with it, eventually, and you mentioned the emerging technology and these different companies, eventually, will they definitely be able to crack it, or is there a chance that they couldn't?
I don't know the proportions in that mixture. It depends how many people are in it and what the percentages of those profiles are, and which one is the perpetrator, or which ones, right? There could be 5 people in that, and the person they're trying to identify, if they're even in that mixture, might only be 10%. And the chances of identifying somebody...
The tip that breaks the case could come in tonight, or it could be sitting in someone's memory, waiting for the right prompt to surface. The investigation is in a state of suspension, waiting for technology, waiting for evidence, waiting for a break. But that does not mean it is over. It means the work is happening in ways that are not visible to the public. Labs are processing samples. Analysts are running algorithms. Investigators are following leads that have not been disclosed. And journalists like Brian Entin are continuing to ask the questions that keep this case in the public eye and keep pressure on the institutions responsible for solving it. There is something else worth noting. The ransom communications, the Bitcoin demands, the contradictory notes that have been sent to media outlets, all of that creates a digital trail. Cryptocurrency is not as anonymous as people think. Blockchain transactions are permanent and traceable. Law enforcement agencies have developed sophisticated tools for tracking Bitcoin payments and identifying the wallets and individuals behind them. If the people who took Nancy are the same people sending ransom demands, every message they send is another thread. Every Bitcoin wallet they create is another data point. Every communication is another opportunity for them to make a mistake that exposes them. The compulsion to keep reaching out, to keep sending messages, to keep trying to extract payment or control the narrative may ultimately be what leads to their identification. Because the more they communicate, the more evidence they create. The institutional accountability question is still unresolved. The supervisor who allegedly had no experience leading a homicide investigation was assigned to this case on day 1. That decision was made by someone. There is a chain of command. There is a decision-making structure. And 73 days later, there has been no public accounting for how that happened or what has been done to correct it. Sheriff Nanos, according to reports, is facing a deadline from the Board of Supervisors to answer questions under oath about his leadership. Whether that results in meaningful accountability or just political theater remains to be seen, but the fact that the question is being asked publicly means the pressure is building. It means the failures are being documented. It means this case will not be allowed to disappear quietly. Let's talk about what we know and what we do not know. We know Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her Catalina Foothills home. We know there was no forced entry. We know blood was found on the porch. We know DNA was recovered but is a complex mixture that current technology cannot resolve. We know the first 48 hours were mishandled. We know specialized forensic units were not the first to arrive. We know ransom notes have been sent demanding Bitcoin. We know those notes have been contradictory and erratic. We know Nancy was 84 and dependent on a pacemaker. We know a cold case detective believes the kidnappers underestimated her physical fragility. We know new DNA software is being fast-tracked. We know experts hope for a second crime scene. We know Brian Entin has stayed in Tucson for 73 days while other reporters moved on. What we do not know is how the perpetrators gained entry. We do not know what the doorbell camera footage shows. We do not know the specifics of the ransom demands. We do not know whether Nancy is alive or deceased. We do not know whether the DNA will ever be solvable. We do not know if a second crime scene exists or will be found. We do not know who is responsible. Those unknowns are where the investigation lives, and they are where it will remain until technology, evidence, or human error provides the break that has so far been elusive. This case matters for reasons that go beyond Nancy Guthrie. It matters because it exposes how our systems respond when the victim does not fit the profile we expect. It matters because it shows what happens when institutional failures in the first critical hours create obstacles that may never be overcome. It matters because it demonstrates the limitations of forensic technology and the hope that emerging tools might solve cases that were previously unsolvable. It matters because it shows what happens when a journalist refuses to move on, even when the story is no longer trending, even when the national media has found something newer and shinier to cover. Brian Entin's sustained presence in Tucson is a case study in accountability journalism. It is a reminder that someone has to stay, someone has to keep asking, someone has to refuse to let the case go cold quietly. Nancy Guthrie is still missing, 73 days and counting. Her family has offered over $1 million for information leading to her safe return. The FBI tip line is open. Anonymous tips are accepted. No identification required. If you know something, if you heard something, if you saw something in the Catalina foothills between January and early February that felt wrong, report it. Because the detail you think is insignificant might be the piece that solves this case. The conversation you overheard. The question someone asked. The vehicle you saw in a place it should not have been. All of it matters. All of it could be the thread. The technology is racing. The investigation is grinding. The public is watching. And somewhere, the people responsible for what happened to Nancy Guthrie are living with the knowledge of what they did. That knowledge is a weight. It creates pressure. It makes people behave in ways that reveal themselves. It makes them reach out when they should stay silent. It makes them send messages they should not send. It makes them create evidence they do not realize they are creating, and eventually, it makes them vulnerable to being caught. This is not a cold case. This is a case in suspension, waiting for the moment when technology catches up, when a witness comes forward, when a mistake is made, when the digital trail is traced back to its source. And when that moment comes, the people who stayed, the people who kept asking questions, the people who refused to let Nancy Guthrie become another name on a list of unsolved disappearances will be there to see it through. If you want to be part of that, if you want to stay informed, if you want to be here when this case breaks, subscribe to True Crime Case Study right now. Hit that like button, turn on notifications, because when the DNA results come back, when the second crime scene is found, when the tip comes in that changes everything, you will not want to find out 2 weeks later. You will want to be part of the community that never stopped watching, that never stopped demanding answers, that never stopped believing Nancy Guthrie deserves justice. This case is still moving. The technology is still developing. The investigation is still active. And we will be here, covering every development, asking every question, holding every institution accountable, until Nancy Guthrie is found and the people responsible are brought to justice. Stay with us. This is not over. The initial assumptions made in those first critical hours may have cost investigators two of the most important things in any criminal investigation: evidence and time. Both are now permanently compromised. And the consequences of that compromise are still unfolding 73 days later. Sheriff Chris Nanos is now facing a deadline from the Pima County Board of Supervisors, April 21st. He must answer questions under oath about his leadership of this investigation or face potential removal from office. That is not a routine performance review. That is a public accountability mechanism being triggered because the failures in this case have become impossible to ignore. The pressure is no longer coming only from journalists like Brian Entin. It is coming from the elected officials who oversee the sheriff's department. It is coming from a community that has watched 73 days pass without an arrest. It is coming from a family that has offered over $1 million and is still waiting for answers. Joe Giacalone, the retired NYPD sergeant who has been one of the most consistent voices of professional analysis on this case, delivered a message this week that was blunt and public. He said, "You have nothing until the DNA comes back. And even if it comes back, you do not know if it will be usable. The trees are not going to shake themselves." That statement captures the precarious position the investigation currently sits in. Everything depends on a forensic breakthrough that may or may not arrive. And even if it does arrive, it may or may not produce a usable result. The foundation of this investigation was cracked before it was fully built. And every forensic obstacle, every erratic ransom note, every dead lead has to be understood inside that context. DNA expert C.C. Moore, one of the most credentialed genetic genealogists in the country, sat down with Brian Entin and explained the central forensic challenge in terms that every person following this case needs to understand precisely. The DNA samples recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home are mixed, multiple people's genetic material overlapping on the same surfaces. This is common in any family setting where relatives visit regularly, where caregivers come and go, where service workers touch doorknobs and countertops in the course of their normal activities. But it creates a forensic problem that the system's law enforcement has relied on for decades cannot solve. The CODIS database, the FBI's combined DNA index system that contains genetic profiles of convicted offenders across the country, cannot produce a reliable identification from a mixed sample. CODIS is built for single-source DNA, one person's clean genetic profile, run against a database of known offenders. When you have a mixture of 3, 4, or 5 people's DNA layered on top of each other, the system cannot tell you which sequence belongs to whom. It returns no usable match. Standard STR technology, the short tandem repeat analysis that has been the backbone of forensic DNA work since the 1990s, has the same limitation. It can confirm that multiple contributors are present, but it cannot reliably separate those contributors and isolate the unknown person whose identity investigators are trying to determine. SNP analysis, single nucleotide polymorphism technology, is more advanced. It is better suited for handling complex mixtures. But SNP analysis for forensic purposes only became common around 2018. The software needed to fully separate overlapping genetic sequences is still catching up to the problem it needs to solve. This is emerging technology. It is real, it works, and it has produced results in cases that previously seemed unsolvable. But it is not yet standard equipment in every forensic lab, and the most powerful versions of this software, the ones capable of handling the most complex mixtures, are still being developed and refined. C.C. Moore told Brian Entin something that converts this obstacle into forward momentum. Companies working with law enforcement were already planning to release new mixture deconvolution software. Moore believes that release has been moved up, fast-tracked, specifically because of the Nancy Guthrie case. Think about what that means in practical terms. A technology company looked at the public attention on this investigation, looked at the forensic roadblock the mixed DNA represents, and decided to accelerate their development timeline. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance has become the forcing function for a technological breakthrough that was already coming but not yet here. The FBI is not waiting for a standard match from existing databases. They are waiting for software powerful enough to strip the mixture apart layer by layer, eliminate the family genetic material that should be present in any home, and isolate a clean genetic sequence belonging to the stranger who carried that Ozark Trail backpack through the front door of Nancy's house. ASU forensics professor April Stonehouse told Brian Entin that DNA has cracked cases built on far less than what investigators have in the Guthrie case. She cited a 1981 Pima County murder that went unsolved for 25 years before DNA technology single-handedly resolved it. 25 years of cold case status, 25 years of a family waiting for answers, and then the technology caught up. The science advanced, the evidence that had been sitting in storage finally yielded a result. That is the precedent investigators are working with. The technology is racing. The question this case now lives inside is not whether the software will eventually produce a name. It is whether it will produce one before the trail goes completely cold, before witnesses forget the details that might matter, before the Bitcoin trail loses its forensic value, before Nancy Guthrie becomes another name on a list of unsolved disappearances that the public eventually stops asking about. There is a theory that I keep coming back to as I work through the available information on this case. Because if this theory is correct, it explains every single anomaly that nobody has been able to coherently account for. The contradictory ransom notes, the erratic Bitcoin demands, the shifting story, the communication patterns that do not match a coherent kidnapping for ransom operation. Detective Brian Martin of the Fort Wayne Police Department, a cold case specialist who has spent his career studying exactly this type of crime, told Brian Entin something this week that I want every person watching to hold on to. The kidnappers may have made a fatal mistake. They catastrophically underestimated the physical fragility of an 84-year-old woman entirely dependent on a pacemaker to sustain her life. Martin's exact words were that it scares him to think that somebody may have taken Miss Guthrie and she had some sort of medical event when it was happening, because obviously it would be an incredibly stressful situation, very taxing on somebody. Now think about what that theory explains. The doorbell camera at Nancy's home went dark at 1:47 in the morning. The pacemaker signal dropped at 2:28. That 41-minute window is where this crime was completed. If Nancy suffered a cardiovascular crisis inside that window, if the physical shock of the abduction triggered a medical emergency that the kidnappers had not planned for and were not prepared to handle, then the entire ransom operation collapsed before it had fully begun. A plan built around a living hostage does not survive if the hostage dies before the first demand is delivered. What was supposed to be a controlled $6 million transaction became something the perpetrators had to manage in panic, in the dark, in the early hours of a Sunday morning in the Arizona desert. The ransom notes that followed were not a coherent negotiation. They were a cover story written by people whose plan had already gone catastrophically wrong. Every contradiction in those notes, every shift in the demands, every change in the story makes sense if you understand that the perpetrators were no longer operating according to their original plan. They were improvising around a disaster. On April 6th, the same day Savannah Guthrie walked back onto the Today Show for the first time in 2 months, new notes arrived at TMZ from the same sender who had been demanding Bitcoin since February. The first note demanded half a Bitcoin, approximately $35,000, to deliver the kidnappers on a silver platter. The sender claimed they had been offering this information since February 11th and had been ignored. They accused the FBI of arrogance. They said the case was frozen, but egos remained hot. Then a second note arrived shortly after TMZ went live on air. The sender claimed they saw Nancy alive with her captors in the state of Sonora, Mexico. International element introduced, cross-border investigation implied. Then the story shifted again. Nancy was dead. Pay 1 Bitcoin to learn where the body was located. 3 messages, 3 contradictory claims, hours apart. Detective Martin told Brian Entin that whoever sent these notes wants to be heard. That is the surface assessment. The sender is communicating compulsively. They cannot stay silent even when silence would serve their interests. But I want to go further than that assessment. Because the contradiction pattern in these notes is not just attention-seeking behavior, it tells you something specific about the sender's relationship to actual information. A sender who genuinely knows where Nancy is does not need to change their story. The truth does not shift. If you have real information about a real location, that information stays consistent because it is grounded in reality. A sender whose story keeps changing is either fabricating entirely or describing a situation that has already changed because the plan they were connected to has already collapsed. The shift from millions of dollars to thousands of dollars to body location is the behavioral signature of someone improvising around a disaster. That is not the communication pattern of someone in control. That is the communication pattern of someone trying to extract whatever value they can from a situation that has spun out of their original plan. Brian Entin has been consistent on one point throughout his coverage that I believe matters enormously for the future of this investigation. The Bitcoin trail is traceable. Blockchain transactions leave a permanent record. Cryptocurrency forensics has identified perpetrators in cases far more technically sophisticated than this one. The sender who keeps reaching out to TMZ may believe they are operating in digital shadow. They are not. Every message they send is another thread. Every Bitcoin wallet they create is another data point. Every transaction is another opportunity for forensic analysts to trace activity back to its source. The technology for blockchain investigation has advanced significantly in recent years. Specialized firms work directly with law enforcement to follow cryptocurrency through the digital ecosystem, identifying the wallets, the exchanges, the conversion points, and ultimately the individuals behind seemingly anonymous transactions. The compulsion to keep reaching out, to keep sending demands, to keep trying to control the narrative may ultimately be what exposes the people responsible. Because the more they communicate, the more evidence they create. The more evidence they create, the more vectors of investigation become available. And eventually, one of those vectors leads to a name. 4 threads. All live, all connected, all pointing at the same central question. The institutional failure in the first 48 hours explains why the forensic foundation of this case is shakier than it should be. It explains why evidence that should have been preserved in the first critical hours may have been compromised. It explains why specialized forensic units were not the first to arrive and why blood evidence was not given the attention it required until media reporting forced the issue. It also explains why Brian Entin's persistent pressure on the official investigation has been the only consistent force of accountability in a case where the institutional framework keeps cracking under examination. The DNA race explains why Day 73 has produced no arrest. The mixture is unsolvable with current standard technology. The software being fast-tracked is not yet deployed. The investigation is waiting for a tool that does not yet exist in the form needed to crack this specific puzzle. But the absence of an arrest on Day 73 does not mean there will be no arrest on Day 100 or 200 or 300. The technology is coming. C.C. Moore believes it has been accelerated specifically because of this case. When that mixture is separated and a clean sequence is isolated, the entire investigation gets its anchor. Everything that has been waiting on a forensic identification suddenly has a direction. Suspect interviews can become confirmations. Surveillance footage can be cross-referenced against known individuals. The Bitcoin trail can be matched to specific people. The case that has felt stalled becomes a case in active pursuit. The medical fragility theory explains every anomaly the ransom communication pattern has produced. It points toward a perpetrator or perpetrators whose plan did not survive contact with the human fragility of the woman at the center of it. People who planned a ransom operation that depended on a living hostage. People who did not account for the reality that an 84-year-old woman with a pacemaker is not a static asset to be transported and held. She is a human being whose body has limits, whose heart depends on technology to function, whose stress response cannot withstand the kind of trauma a violent abduction inflicts. If the perpetrators failed to account for that, if they treated Nancy like a younger, healthier hostage might be treated, then the moment her body could not handle what was being done to her, the entire operation became something they were not prepared to manage. The contradictory communications that followed are consistent with people scrambling to extract value or control from a situation that no longer matched their plan. The Bitcoin battlefield explains why the perpetrator cannot stay silent, why that compulsion to keep reaching out, to keep sending messages, to keep trying to insert themselves into the narrative may ultimately be what exposes them. Silence would be the smart strategy. Silence would limit the evidence trail. Silence would force investigators to work harder for every piece of information. But the sender behind the TMZ notes is not staying silent. They are sending messages. They are creating digital records. They are making themselves visible in ways that traceable forensic technology can document. Every message is a thread that can be pulled. At the heart of all 4 threads is one race: the speed of scientific and technological progress against the fading traces of a 73-day-old case. Memory degrades, witnesses move on, surveillance footage gets overwritten, physical evidence loses integrity, but forensic technology improves, database capabilities expand, analytical tools become more sophisticated. The race is between those two trajectories, and the outcome depends on which one moves faster. Brian Entin is still in Tucson, still asking the questions that the official investigation has not answered, still refusing to let this case become the silence that swallows people whole. Because in a case this cold on the surface and this burning underneath, someone has to keep shaking the trees. Someone has to keep pressure on the institutions responsible for finding answers. Someone has to keep the public engaged so that tips keep coming in, so that pressure keeps building, so that the case does not fade into the background noise of a news cycle that always wants something new. Let's talk about what the medical fragility theory means for how we should understand the perpetrators. If they did underestimate Nancy's physical fragility, that tells us something about who they are. It tells us they may not have had detailed knowledge of her medical condition. They may have known she was elderly. They may have known she lived alone. They may have known the layout of her home well enough to gain entry without leaving evidence of force. But they apparently did not understand or did not adequately plan for the reality that she was pacemaker dependent, that she was on daily medication, that her body could not absorb the kind of trauma a violent abduction inflicts. That suggests a level of preparation that was incomplete. Someone who fully understood Nancy's medical situation would have planned differently, would have moved more carefully, would have anticipated the possibility of medical crisis and built contingencies around it. The perpetrators apparently did none of that, or if they did, their contingencies failed. This also tells us something about the nature of the entry. The lack of forced entry has been one of the most discussed aspects of this case from the beginning. Experts who have worked similar cases have offered scenarios: someone who watched and waited for an opportunity, someone who hid inside the home, someone with prior access. All of those scenarios require some level of familiarity with the property or with Nancy's routines. None of them are random. Random kidnapping of an 84-year-old woman from her home in the Catalina foothills is statistically extraordinary. The infrastructure required, the planning required, the entry method required all point to deliberate targeting. Someone chose Nancy Guthrie specifically. Someone studied her enough to know when she would be home, how to access the property, what to expect. That study, that targeting, that planning is the foundation of the crime. And if the planning failed because the planners did not understand the medical realities of their target, that failure is built into the case from the start. The April 21st deadline for Sheriff Nanos is a pressure point that could change the dynamics of this investigation significantly. If he is required to answer questions under oath about how this case was handled, those answers become public record. The decisions that were made in the first 48 hours, the assignment of an inexperienced supervisor, the classification of the scene as a search and rescue operation rather than a criminal investigation, the delayed response of specialized forensic units, all of that becomes subject to formal accountability. That kind of accountability has consequences beyond the immediate case. It creates pressure on the entire department to demonstrate that it has learned from these failures. It creates incentive to push harder on the current investigation, to produce results, to show that the institution can correct course even when the foundation was cracked at the start. Whether that pressure produces a breakthrough or simply more institutional defensiveness remains to be seen. But the deadline exists. The accountability mechanism has been triggered, and the public will see the outcome. There is an aspect of this case that has not received enough attention publicly: the role of the family. Nancy Guthrie's family has offered over $1 million in reward money for information leading to her safe return. That is an extraordinary commitment. It signals desperation. It signals the family's belief that someone out there knows something and might be motivated by financial incentive to come forward. Reward money in cases like this can produce results. It can shake loose the witness who saw something but did not want to get involved. It can incentivize the acquaintance of a perpetrator to make an anonymous call. It can change the calculation for someone sitting on information they have been afraid to share. Whether the reward in this case has produced any meaningful tips that are being actively investigated is not publicly known, but the offer remains open. The incentive remains in place. And as the case continues, the value of that reward to someone with information becomes increasingly significant. The tip line for this case is 1-800-CALL-FBI. Anonymous. No identification required. If you have any information about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, about anyone who showed unusual interest in her or her property, about any conversation that felt slightly wrong, about any vehicle you saw in the Catalina foothills between January 1st and February 2nd that did not belong, that detail matters. Report it. The most important witness in this case may not even know they are a witness yet. They might think what they saw or heard was nothing. But in an investigation built on forensic puzzles and institutional failures, the tip that breaks the case might be sitting in someone's memory right now, waiting for the right prompt to surface. The convergence of these four threads is what makes this case both hopeful and frightening. Hopeful because the technology is advancing, the digital trail is real, the perpetrator cannot stay silent, and the investigation is under public scrutiny. Frightening because 73 days have already passed, Nancy Guthrie remains missing, and every day that goes by without a break makes the next break harder to achieve. The window for finding her alive, if she was ever still alive after that 41-minute window between the doorbell camera going dark and the pacemaker signal dropping, has likely closed. The most realistic hope at this point is that the investigation can identify the people responsible, recover Nancy's remains if she has not survived, and bring some measure of justice to a family that has waited months for answers. What does justice look like in a case like this? It starts with identification. The DNA must be processed, the mixture deconvolved, the unknown contributor isolated and matched. It continues with arrest. The people responsible must be located, taken into custody, charged with the crimes they committed. It moves through prosecution. The evidence must be presented, the case proven, convictions secured. And it ends, if it ever truly ends, with whatever closure a family can find when their loved one has been taken from them in the most violent and senseless way imaginable. None of that happens without the work that is currently underway. The forensic processing, the technology development, the journalistic pressure, the institutional accountability, the public engagement, all of it has to continue. All of it has to converge. And eventually, if the threads hold and the work continues, all of it has to produce a result. Brian Entin has been the constant in this story, the one journalist who refused to leave when others moved on, the one voice that kept asking questions when the official channels went quiet, the one presence that kept sources comfortable enough to share what they knew. His role in this case will likely be studied in journalism schools for years to come. Not because he broke the case single-handedly, but because he demonstrated what sustained investigative journalism can accomplish when it refuses to follow the news cycle, when it commits to a story for the long haul, when it treats accountability as a continuous obligation rather than a one-time scoop. The fact that we know about the institutional failures in the first 48 hours is because of his work. The fact that we understand the DNA challenge and the technology being developed to address it is because of his work. The fact that the medical fragility theory has entered public discussion is because of his work. The fact that the Bitcoin trail and its traceability is being kept in front of the public is because of his work. This case is still moving. It may not look like it from the outside. There may be no daily press conferences, no breaking news banners, no dramatic announcements of arrests. But the work is happening. Labs are processing DNA. Software is being developed. Blockchain analysts are tracing cryptocurrency. Investigators are following leads that have not been disclosed. Sources are weighing whether to come forward. Memories are being prompted. The 73-day mark is not the end of this case. It is a checkpoint in an ongoing process. And the next significant development, when it comes, will likely come without warning. The sender behind the Bitcoin notes will probably keep sending messages. Each one creates more evidence. Each one makes the eventual identification more achievable. The technology for separating mixed DNA samples will probably be ready sooner than later, and when it is, the sample from Nancy's home will likely be among the first to be analyzed. The institutional accountability process will probably produce some kind of public reckoning, whether through the Board of Supervisors or through other political and legal mechanisms. The family will probably continue offering the reward and pursuing every avenue available to them, and Brian Entin will probably continue to be in Tucson, asking questions, building sources, and refusing to let this case fade. Nancy Guthrie deserves answers. Her family deserves answers. The community of Catalina Foothills deserves answers. And the public deserves to understand what happened, how it happened, and how to prevent it from happening to someone else. This case is not just about one woman, though one woman is at the center of it. It is about how our systems respond when the most vulnerable among us are targeted. It is about the limits of forensic technology and the promise of new tools that are still being developed. It is about the role of journalism in holding institutions accountable when they fail. It is about the persistence required to keep a case alive when the news cycle wants to move on. All of that is part of what this story means, and all of it matters. If you have made it this far, you understand why this case is different. You understand why Brian Entin has stayed in Tucson when others left. You understand why the DNA technology is being fast-tracked. You understand why the medical fragility theory explains every anomaly in the ransom communications. You understand why the Bitcoin trail will eventually expose the people responsible. And you understand why the institutional failure in the first 48 hours created obstacles that have shaped everything that followed. The 4 threads are live. The investigation is grinding forward. The technology is racing, and the people who took Nancy Guthrie are out there somewhere, living with the knowledge of what they did. If you want to be here when this case breaks, if you want to be part of the community that has refused to let Nancy Guthrie disappear from public attention, subscribe to True Crime Case Study right now. Hit that like button. Turn on notifications. Because when the DNA mixture is separated and a name finally emerges, when the Bitcoin trail leads investigators to the people responsible, when the arrest finally comes that this case has been building toward for 73 days, you will not want to find out about it 2 weeks later. You will want to be part of the audience that watched it unfold in real time. That asked the right questions, that demanded the accountability, that believed Nancy Guthrie deserved justice and refused to let her become another forgotten name. Drop your analysis in the comments below. Which of the 4 threads do you think breaks this case first? The DNA technology that could finally produce a name? The Bitcoin trail that the perpetrator cannot stop adding to? The medical evidence that explains why the ransom plan collapsed? Or something that has not surfaced yet, something we do not even know to look for? Tell us where in the world you are watching from tonight. Type amen in the comments for Nancy Guthrie. This case is still moving, Brian Entin is still there, the technology is racing, the accountability is building, and when this case cracks, True Crime Case Study will be here to bring you every detail. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and never stop demanding justice for Nancy Guthrie.